Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Sean Moore. I'm the Manager of Special Projects and Initiatives at CADCA. We're going to have a great webinar today from Shelley Mann-Lev called Reaching Students Where They Are, School-Based Prevention. Shelley, could you advance to the first slide? So this webinar is being conducted as part of the Opioid Response Network. This is a grant that has been set up by SAMHSA to deliver training and technical assistance for those working on different aspects of the opioid epidemic. Specifically, we're delivering technical assistance on a request basis to those working in prevention, treatment, and recovery of opioid use disorders. The Opioid Response Network has several overlapping tiers of consultants across the country. So there's a network of prevention consultants managed by CADCA. There are some amazing recovery consultants who are working on behalf of C4 Innovations. And of course, the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, our lead organization, has a team of treatment consultants across the country, all with 2 or more years experience implementing medication for addiction and helping others sort of build up their own practice within that realm. So every state and territory has a designated team, but we're also able to work with consultants from across the country, depending on their area of specialty or expertise. The website you should be directed to, and of course we can connect you with it at any point, is opioidresponsenetwork.org. There is a button on the top right of that web page saying submit a TA request or submit a request. And of course, if you have any questions, you could also email or call AAAP to understand more about the Opioid Response Network as a whole. Funding for this initiative does come from SAMHSA, and the views expressed by the speaker and by myself today don't necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Department of Health and Human Services. And again, what we're working on with the Opioid Response Network is to build that local capacity as much as possible and help network local resources. We're not trying to recreate the wheel or work in competition with anyone, but we're really trying to identify and then fill gaps in the continuum of care. So we are working to provide evidence-based practices in prevention, treatment, and recovery. And we're working to do those across the country, but working at a very local level. And so again, all of our work is based on requests for technical assistance and training. And so that website, opioidresponsenetwork.org, is really how all of our work that we can do for you starts. A little bit of housekeeping for the webinar today. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box that you can use to chat with other participants, but do pay special attention to the Q&A box. That is how you could ask questions, and we'll turn to questions towards the end of the webinar today. I'll be looking at that throughout the webinar and pulling questions for Shelley that we'll address towards the end. You will be muted, so we won't hear if you are speaking into your mic. So do make best use of that Q&A chat box below. We'll be sending out a PDF of this presentation after the webinar. A recording will also be available. And please email me at smore@cadca.org. Email me if you have any questions about this webinar. If you would like to be notified of other webinars as they are scheduled. And I'm seeing, yeah, so chat is enabled to all attendees. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker for today. Shelley Mann-Lev is currently a prevention consultant in the Southwest for the Opioid Response Network, and she serves as the policy co-chair of the New Mexico Public Health Association. She co-founded Santa Fe Prevention Alliance and served as the director there right up until last year in 2018. And she's recently retired from Santa Fe Public Schools, where she was the prevention coordinator for almost 2 decades. Shelley developed and participated in numerous grant projects in the school, bringing evidence-informed prevention strategies to all of Santa Fe schools and also the local communities. These strategies addressed all levels of prevention and early intervention for students and families, from K through 8 social emotional curricula to supportive consequences for students who violated school policy. She's provided trainings, community programs, and policies to reduce substance use as part of the New Mexico Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drug Prevention Workforce Development Training System. And she resides in Santa Fe, is passionate about public health policy and educational system reform to improve equity and impact for all. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shelley. And again, thank you all for dialing in today.
So, welcome. Thank you so much for listening and for caring about our kids. Nothing you do for children is ever wasted. That has sat on my desk for 20 years, still sits on my desk, because truly it's what I've dedicated my life to. And I know all of you who are listening to this webinar session also deeply care about the youth and children in our communities. I worked in the Santa Fe Public Schools with 13,000 students and their families, and really have the opportunity to do what I hope you will do or are doing, which is to reach those young people and their families where they're at. Why focus on schools? Children spend about 1/3 of their wake time in school. It's also where they spend most of their time with their peers who influence their substance use behaviors. Schools also plays a large role in reinforcing healthy behaviors and create environments that can support healthy development, can address the key risk and protective factors that we know so greatly impact substance use. So what are we going to do in this time together today? We're going to focus on those risk and protective factors, because by looking at them, we can see the tremendous opportunities we have in schools to impact them. We're also going to learn some of the language of schools, which is the 3-tiered approach that they take, very similar to what we do in prevention, but schools language it a little differently, and I think it'll help us in our work with schools. Thirdly, we're going to take a look at those 3 tiers of interventions and evidence-based, developmentally appropriate strategies that we can implement in schools that will help reach our goal of reducing and preventing substance use amongst youth. Fourthly, we're going to look at school policies. We'll do it briefly, but I think you'll see throughout, and think about how policies can really build in and sustain prevention strategies. And finally, we're going to learn a little bit more about school culture. Schools, like everything, have their own culture, and being culturally competent to work with school staff, school officials, students, and families in schools will be helpful in your work. So the framework, I think many of you are familiar with the socio-ecological model, those overlapping layers, starting with society and public policy, community, organizational, interpersonal, and then the individual. We're going to focus on that organizational level, which is schools, which can greatly impact the interpersonal and the individual levels within that. So let's take a look at risk and protective factors, starting with that organizational level, schools. For the first two, for organizational and interpersonal, I've mixed risk and protective, understanding that, for example, with schools, school connectedness, high school connectedness, feeling that adults and peers at school care about you is a protective factor. Low is a risk factor if you don't feel that way. The quality of the school climate can be a protective factor if it's positive and supportive, can be a risk factor if it's negative and unsupportive. Schools that have clear, consistent rules with monitoring are a powerful protective factor for students. Again, something that can be done through policy, staff training. Appropriate and strong school policies and programs also can make a difference in being a protective factor. Less availability of drugs. You can just imagine one of those questions on our surveys, how often have you been offered drugs at school? If the answer is not at all in the last 12 months, you've got low drug availability at schools, and that's a solid protective factor. and academic achievement, which is the main goal of schools and one that's a protective factor as well when it's high. In the interpersonal realm, family, we have parental monitoring. Again, parents who monitor and have appropriate discipline, that's a strong protective factor. Family connectedness, parent engagement in the schools, parents' attitudes and beliefs about substances, and then very importantly, as a key risk factor, is parents who misuse substances or have risky substance use behavior are much more likely to have children who have risky substance use behavior. And then in the area of peers, schools are full of those. We have the use of tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs. If you have peers who misuse substances, that's a significant risk factor. And it depends whether it's protective or a risk factor, those norms about substance use. That attitude everybody uses is a risk factor for substance use. If your peers share that sense that alcohol use is risky, and that's a protective factor. I want to talk briefly about individual level factors because schools can have a strong influence on those. I've divided into the two columns because I think it's helpful to look at that way. Risk factors, we talked about drug availability at school. Well, access to drugs, whether it's at home, school, or through your peers, is a significant individual risk factor. Other substance use, and especially early initiation. Mental health issues like anxiety and depression. Early aggressive behavior, age of 5, 6, 7, and schools can have a tremendous impact at that age on early aggressive behavior. Impulsive behavior. Some of you may be familiar with the marshmallow study done back in the 60s, but are you one of those people? Is your youth one of those people who can wait 15 minutes to get that second marshmallow or that second Oreo? Or do they grab it and eat it right away? And then thrill seeking. If you have somebody like my brother who we were grateful lived to be 20, and we have a number of youth who seek thrills, who we call them adrenaline junkies, right? But who really want those thrills in their life. Protective factors may be even more important. And the beauty of our understanding of substance use is if we intervene in protective factors, strengthening those, we can really protect youth from many of the challenges they faced. So academic achievement, connectedness to school and family, peers, positive peer relationships, involvement in meaningful activities, social skills, self-regulation and emotional management, very important. And then finally, those attitudes and perceived disapproval and belief. Another important individual risk factor is adverse childhood experiences. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years since that very important landmark study of ACEs, they're called. I think many of you are familiar with them, that these experiences of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction that happen before the age of 18 can significantly disrupt brain development and limit social, emotional, cognitive functioning. ACEs are the root cause of many serious academic, social, and behavioral problems. And depending upon our communities, could be anywhere from a quarter to even a half of our students have experienced multiple ACEs. There is data to suggest that each ACE, each experience of childhood trauma, increases the risk of early initiation 2 to 4 times. And some studies have estimated that more than half of drug use problems are attributed to ACEs. Again, there is much that schools and communities can do to strengthen those social conditions, addressing social determinants of health, as well as that social, emotional, cognitive abilities and capacities to mitigate the effects of ACEs so that those harmful effects don't, in fact, play out. And finally, in terms of risk factors, there are particular populations, groups of youth and adults who are more vulnerable. Examples of those are LGBTQ+ youth who are experiencing homelessness. We'll actually list those out when we get into our second tier of intervention. But I think it's important to know when we talk about risk factors that we need to focus on those high-risk groups and learn about those high-risk groups. So we need data, right? When we're doing prevention programs, it's critical to know what we're dealing with and what do we need to prioritize. We want to know about the prevalence and trends in terms of substance use, including the non-medical use of prescription medications. We very much need to know about the age of initiation. And that's particularly important because I think there's a general sense, we need to really focus our prevention efforts on high school. But actually, in many cases, it needs to be middle school, upper elementary school. Some students are starting to use, and depending upon our community. And then, of course, we need to know about our risk and protective factors because, for example, early aggression, that means intervening with pre-K or those early elementary years. How do we get the data? Well, schools are key. Youth Risk and Behavior Survey is a national survey done every 2 years, coordinated by the CDC, that schools implement in middle and high school. It's a national, state, and generally district level. Gives us all kinds of information, and many states supplement that by, for example, California uses the Healthy Kids Survey, New Mexico has youth risk and resiliency questions, and some districts and schools add supplemental questions. One thing I'd like to really encourage you to do is help your school do these surveys. It makes a huge difference. First of all, if they have a decision, it's voluntary whether they participate or not. You can help them opt in by helping to show them, enhancing their motivation for participating, what the value of it is. You can also help them opt in, all in, by offering to assist, organizing, administering, collecting, submitting. We used to do all of that for our schools. And as a community organization or as a school staff person, you can do that. You can also help them use the data more effectively, producing reports, providing presentations, doing faculty presentations. And then in some cases, you can design supplemental surveys at your schools to get additional information. What kinds of things do we find out from that? I'm not going to show the charts and graphs. We'll get that in a different slide, but I do want to focus on that age of initiation. What we know from the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey from CDC nationally, last done in 2017, is that 15% of our students report early initiation of alcohol, 10% tobacco, 7% marijuana. When I say early initiation, I mean ages 12 or under. The middle school level, we find that they ask before the age of 11, and we have students who report use. So we are talking that by 7th grade, we've got a substantial number of students who are already early involvers in substance use. So that tells us we need to start our prevention early. So let's move on to the school system and call it counting to 3 in prevention education. We know in prevention we talk about universal, selective, and indicated programs. Well, in education, they have a tiered system, very similar. So it's easy to learn for prevention folks. Some folks call it the multi-tiered system of supports, been highly developed in California, sometimes different names, but generally in education, people think about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 levels of systems of support that allow us to serve the needs of all students. Tier 1 is high quality research-based classroom instruction and screening, correlates with our universal work. It's focused on all settings and all students, core curricula and early intervention, preventative, proactive, classroom management, and universal screening. Tier 2, for some students, those who are identified as higher risk because they belong to a high-risk group or based on their individual risk factors. And there we want to focus on frequent monitoring, early intervention, targeted support to groups and individuals. And tier 3, those intensive interventions, comprehensive assessments or evaluation for those students who are already identified as experiencing some mental health or substance use difficulties. And as you can see from this pyramid, 80% of students, tier 1, that's our universal. Tier 2, that secondary level of intervention, 15%, and that much smaller number who need intensive individualized intervention. So we're going to go through all 3 tiers and talk about what some of those evidence-based approaches are. In terms of tier 1, education, classroom instruction, classroom management approaches are a critical part of tier 1. And there has been some research. A lot of people were focusing on knowledge only, and the data shows knowledge only doesn't work. The strongest data supports a focus on social norms and resistance skills and social competence, makes the biggest impact. And then some of the approaches that have focused on self-regulation and emotional management have also shown to have tremendous lifetime protection from substance use and many other problems. When we talk about social norms and resistance skills, one of the programs I'm going to describe, LifeSkills training, has a strong emphasis on that, plus the social competence skills that come with social emotional learning programs. Add in decision-making, goal setting, conflict resolution, stress and anxiety management, and then again, that early anger aggression management. And what you're aiming for is resilience. So what are some of the evidence-based programs? And I've taken a look at this in a lot of detail. And the strongest evidence really exists for the first two programs, which is PAC's Good Behavior Game, Botvin LifeSkills Training. Project Venture has evidence to support it, and there are some other promising programs. And then we'll talk a little bit more about social emotional learning and health education curricula and how they can contribute to a comprehensive prevention program in the schools, Tier 1. So for those of you who aren't familiar with PAC's Good Behavior Game, we call it the gold standard. Here in New Mexico, we're working incredibly hard to reach all of our schools to encourage them to adopt this program, because the evidence, and when I say evidence, I don't just mean short term, I'm talking about 10, 20 years out, is quite profound on the difference it makes in terms of strengthening protective factors, those bars in the blue on the bottom, and decreasing the risk factors. It's trauma informed, has a strong social emotional learning component, really focuses on emotional or self-regulation, and it fits easily into that 3-tiered strategy. I would love to do a special program on it. I encourage you to go to the website. All the references will be included, but it is a classroom management approach. It includes the good behavior game, but it's based on a shared vision of what makes a peaceful, a PACS classroom, and what we want to avoid, what we want to hear, see, and feel in those classrooms. Students work collaboratively to do that. It's trauma informed. It uses cues like a timer, beat the timer, to shorten those transitions from going out to recess to coming back in, which greatly impact instructional time. And it uses peer support and reinforcement to create positive opportunities, highly reinforced. It's not a curriculum, so it doesn't interfere with instruction. In fact, it maximizes it, and really has tremendous outcomes, as I said, including, if you look on the next slide, you'll see the outcome in relation to a huge decrease in alcohol abuse amongst both females and males, and decrease in opioid use, 64% reduction compared to students who hadn't experienced PACS. It's primarily used in grades K through 6. It can be used in middle school. The big disadvantage of PACS is it has a big upfront training cost and materials cost. Once you've invested in training and materials, though, you can continue it forever. Then we have Botvin LifeSkills training, I think the other gold standard model promising program on NREP, blueprints. It has different programs within that. It's been in existence, it's used internationally just as PACS is. It has shown substantial reductions in drug use. Basically, it's a program, you can purchase the elementary package. That's what we did in Santa Fe Public Schools because of our early initiation for grades 4 to 6. You can use the middle school program, also been involved in implementing that for grades 6 through 8. Tends to be 10 to 12 sessions a year. You can bring in outside facilitators or trained teachers. They do have a specific prescription drug abuse prevention module they've developed, and generally it's done in weekly sessions. One of the challenges of Botvin LifeSkills training program is doing it with fidelity, but it is a strong evidence-based program that can be used with multiple populations in many settings. I want to mention Project Venture as an example of a culturally based program specifically targeting Indigenous Native youth, developed by the National Indian Youth Leadership Project. And there are other programs like that. There's a new program that was just developed as a collaboration between the BIE, the Bureau of Indian Education, and Indian Health Service and SAMHSA, called Culture and Drugs Don't Mix. And other Cultural groups have done adaptations of Botvin LifeSkills or other programs. These programs, we need to address culture, obviously, because culture is a strength and a protective factor, and also because it really allows us to reach students and families where they're at. There are also promising programs worth mentioning: Media Literacy Challenge, focusing on alcohol use reduction, and other promising programs. But I think it's important to note, if you do choose a promising program, that evaluation becomes much more important. Social emotional learning is another path that districts take to address substance use prevention and reduction. And SEL, as it's known in the school setting, teaches children to recognize and understand their emotions, feel empathy, make decisions, and build and maintain relationships. It's that social competence part. One of the student outcomes, as you see in this chart, is reduced problem behaviors. And one of those problem behaviors is substance use. A big meta-analysis done by CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And if you're interested in social emotional learning, you want to go to their website, casel.org. It's in the references as well. They did this big meta-analysis in 2015 and found incredible results for academics. Those districts like Cleveland Public Schools has committed to doing that, and many other districts have, saw an average of 13 percentage point increase in academic proficiency. That's the language of schools. They also saw reductions in problem behaviors, including substance use. So social emotional learning programs, for example, in Cleveland, they use something called PACS, promoting alternative thinking strategies in pre-K through 5, second step in middle school. My district used second step K through middle school as a social emotional learning commitment. And then, as I said, we also have health education curricula. And these curricula, hopefully required in policy, K through 12 health education curricula that meets the state standards, can be wonderful ways to incorporate evidence-based programs and practices and SEL, social emotional learning, as well as addressing health literacy and mental health literacy, including mental health promotion, reproductive sexual health education, focusing on that basic knowledge, attitudes, and skills. While knowledge alone does not reduce substance use, credible drug information, not scare tactics, but credible drug information is appropriate. Again, you want to make sure it's developmentally appropriate based on the age of the child. And finally, I see health education curricula as an opportunity to reduce stigma. And that's very important to addressing substance use and mental health challenges for our youth and families. That was students. Now let's talk about relationships. Students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I found out that Teddy Roosevelt is the source of that quote. And caring, school connectedness, feeling, believing that adults and peers in your school care about your learning as well about yourself as an individual is a very important protective factor. And in the school setting, students feel supported and cared for when they feel like their teachers are dedicating their time, interest, and attention and emotional support. Some things that can help with that: smaller schools, schools within a school, identified advisor, coaches, connectors, more meaningful activities, and then really making sure, Dennis Embry talks about a particular strategy in which every student's name posted, the roster's posted on a board. You've got 300 students in a middle school, 250, 400. They all go up on the wall at a faculty meeting. Teachers put their name next to students that they connect with regularly. And then a list is created of those students who don't have a teacher's name or a staff member's name next to them. And at the next meeting, depending upon how many it is, every teacher puts their name next to one of those students so that there's a commitment and a list that that teacher has of the students that they will connect or check in with weekly. It can be a very powerful informal intervention to ensure that caring connection. In addition to students' connectedness to school, we know that involvement in meaningful activities is an important protective factor and one that schools can make a huge difference with. Athletics, and now, as I understand, they have esports, but really encouraging students to be involved in athletics. And of course, the wonderful, wonderful arts. Schools are generally a very important source for theater, music, dance, visual arts, opportunities for creative expression. Clubs, especially student-led, inclusive clubs, volunteering opportunities, and mentoring, both to be mentored, but in many cases for high school, middle school students, and even those upper elementary, to mentor is an incredible way to experience a sense of meaning and engagement. And then finally, in terms of our student focus, positive youth development, youth activism, voice, and helping. So our students, and I believe there's going to be a whole session on this, can be the most important leaders in providing activism, policy, and helping. We'll talk a little bit about peer helping later. I had the privilege of organizing student wellness action teams. That's what SWAT stands for. They did radio programs, put on a staycation events, hosted all kinds of activities, assemblies at their schools. They can make a huge difference in that positive school climate. And of course, for the students themselves who are involved, it builds skills and gives them a sense of agency. And I do want to point out that picture in the bottom corner of students standing at a podium with students behind them, having taken students to city council, county commission, school board, and legislatures. I got to tell you, there's no politician who won't listen to a youth. It's quite amazing. They stop everything, much more than they listen to people like you and me. So getting them involved in activism is incredibly powerful. Schools on a universal level can also have a very positive impact on parents. Strengthening Families programs, incredible evidence-based programs, 7 weekly 2-hour sessions, focus on parental monitoring, caring, and communication. And it's a program specifically for parents and children. And I highly recommend that for schools to consider universally or as well in a tier 2 level. Family dinners and family day. The correlation is that students who eat dinner with their family 4 or more times a week that is the single most powerful indicator that they'll be substance free. Obviously it's correlational, not causational, but CASA, the Center for Addiction and Substance Use at Columbia University, has been promoting family dinners. There's a family dinner project and promoting family day. Families engaging with their students so that increase family engagement and school engagement. And then we can, as preventionists, support family engagement in school. And there's many, many different ways to help schools engage parents, and that protects students. Lastly, in terms of universal is screening, and 2 states, Wisconsin and Massachusetts, require screening in schools. There's again a special session specifically on screening, but I want to bring your attention to what Massachusetts done. They use the CRAFT 2 screen, and universal screening is a critically important school-based universal program for Tier 1. So what about Tier 2? We spent a lot of time on Tier 1 because that's 80% of the students all the time. Tier 2 selective programs are for those individual students identified at higher risk and who are members of a priority group, a population group that's been known or shown by the data to be involved in risky substance use. Students who are LGBTQ+, very important. Students with housing stability, students with disabilities, many times the risk of other students. We've talked about trauma, mental health challenges, thrill seeking, and again, those students who have peers and family with risky substance use behaviors. Interventions for high-risk groups is Tier 2 interventions, starting with that full screen, moving into that brief intervention. And there's, take a look at SBIRT, especially SBIRT in the schools in Massachusetts. Group counseling and education. There's a project called Project Success, student assistance programs that run groups for these students. Particularly, they have a group for students who have family members who've been involved in substance use. And we know now we have students whose parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles or siblings have died from opioid overdoses, and they need targeted support. Groups can also be run through the school-based health centers. And there's a special program that's been developed called the Prevention Program that focuses on personality. It's 2 sessions, 2 sessions designed for kids with ADHD, 2 sessions or impulse challenges, 2 sessions designed for kids with anxiety, another set for depression, and another set for thrill seeking. So we have these targeted interventions. We can also use trained support like natural helpers or mental health first aid. That's for adults, and natural helpers being training peers to reach out to higher risk students. In addition, at Tier 2, we can have dedicated activities for special groups. There's clubs called GSAs, Gender and Sexuality Alliances, for LGBTQ+ students and their allies. And there's also special programs. You can do arts programs, for example, for youth who are experiencing housing instability or homelessness. And finally, of course, you can provide individualized or small group support for improved academic performance and to keep students engaged, connected to, and in school. Dropping out, a huge risk factor for substance use. So tutoring, mentoring, or having specialized student assistant teams meetings, SAT teams they're called, again, another education language in which faculty, staff, facilitators sometimes, maybe the school counselor, parents, and youth are involved in those meetings. Finally, what about athletes? They're a group we can't afford to ignore. There's a fabulous program called Life of an Athlete, but coach trainings, training youth leaders so that athletes are models of substance-free life versus using substances, because by and large, our students look up to other athletes. And we do need to pay special attention to athletes with injuries and the issue of opioids and where that can lead. And lastly, I want to focus on the Tier 3 indicated intensive interventions. These are for students who are already engaging in substance use or are already showing signs of mental illness. Our 5%, right, our 3 to 5%, how do we identify them? Through screening, referral, and schools through violations. So again, through that universal screening, followed by Tier 2, brief intervention, and then for students who, in fact, are shown to be at very high risk of likely having a substance use disorder, referral to treatment, using motivational enhancing, skilled, trained folks to help us with that. Referrals can be made by teachers, any school staff, or other youth if they're involved with natural helpers and been trained. And then finally, I say it's the lucky kids who are caught. I say that to parents who are complaining, but those kids have the opportunity for supportive consequences, restorative justice, supportive consequences that hopefully are designed through our great policies to help them stay in school, as opposed to suspensions and expulsions that keep them out of school on the streets, putting them and our communities at higher risk. We want to leverage violations for intensive assessment and intervention. Tier 3 is when you want a comprehensive evaluation or assessment done, because rarely is substance use something in isolation, or if it is a substance use disorder, it requires treatment. And this is where drug testing can be appropriate. If a student has been involved in a substance use violation, drug testing can be done either through teen court or through the school health center. And I hope you are all familiar with teen court and support those programs in your community. Schools can refer to teen courts instead of the juvenile justice system having peers be involved in assigning consequences and creating different norms and expectations for behavior. Also for Tier 3, want to stress the need for these students to have overdose prevention response education and Narcan access. We're talking about saving lives. So we want to train our nurses and make sure that they have Narcan. And as you can see in the graph on the right, that's being done all over the country. We also want to train our students in some cases, ask them, they may be living with parents or have peers who are using heroin or prescription opioids or other opioids. And we want to make sure that they have the skills and resources that they need. And finally, we want to be doing the education around overdose prevention and response. What are the warning signs of an overdose? Things like don't mix depressants, alcohol with opioids. Very important. And for Tier 3, schools desperately need partnerships. They cannot do all this themselves. School-based health clinics, mental health services that are actually located in the schools, elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools can provide space to community organizations to provide mental health services covered by Medicaid and other programs on site, as well as, of course, students can be referred to the community. And finally, for families, there are a number of evidence-based approaches like the multisystemic therapy for juveniles, an in-home based wraparound approach, as well as other kinds of targeted programs. And in the case of this 3 to 5%, you want to provide strong levels of support, both for academics, behavior, as well as substance use treatment if needed. So all staff need training. Depending upon their role, they need more training, but all staff need to understand what's being done in terms of individual interventions. They need general prevention knowledge about, what's going on with substances. There was years, it's not that far away, when people had no idea that we were having a problem with non-prescription use of opioid painkillers. They had no idea about vaping and vaping devices. So we need general prevention knowledge so that our staff understand. And those staff who are implementing evidence-based programs really need to understand what it means to implement them with fidelity. And that training, hopefully, when it comes to evidence-based programs, is followed by coaching and check-ins, because fidelity is challenging, especially in a school setting. Staff also, ideally all staff would be trained in warning signs and how to refer. Some districts actually formalize that with a written checklist where those warning signs, potentially for substance use or other behavioral challenges, are listed. Staff can fill out that form, submit it to the counseling office, and also can be trained in how do you do a warm handoff? What do you say to students and families? Those staff who are involved in providing selective and indicated interventions need training in doing those interventions, whether they're going to be doing the screening, they're going to be doing the small groups, they're going to be doing the more intensive kinds of evaluations. And finally, all staff need to know the policies and how to enforce. Now we're going to take a moment to talk about best practice in school policies. This is an area that I think as prevention specialists, we would call environmental strategies. Very important policy is a very important way to define requirements, set expectations, and then return as a way of ensuring that there's true sustainability. So what are the best practices in school policies? Need to address possession, use, distribution, and paraphernalia. And that needs to be based on the latest knowledge of what substances are being used in your community. Goal being to reduce the availability of drugs at school. And again, we want to create those healthy environments. So you need to be specific about vaping devices, be specific about possession, and what the consequences for each of these are. There needs to be consistent enforcement. That can be a real challenge for schools. Situations where you've got the basketball star the week before the finals. What's the consequences of that student being caught with pills, non-prescription, not taken, not appropriately, versus the D student who's failing, right? And you can have that can be a big challenge. So policies have to address consistent enforcement, being addressed in training as well, with supportive and restorative consequences. Suspension may be necessary in some cases, a timeout, but what we know by and large is when students are suspended, they're not staying home and reading. Their parents are not home with them monitoring, despite what we want to have happen. Instead, it's the opposite. They're free to use even more. So we want restorative, supportive consequences that include appropriate assessments and services, and using those to leverage. We want to make sure the policies talk about communication expectations, how often, and to all the different audiences, and address who needs to be trained and how frequently. Finally, the policies need to be monitored, evaluated, and requirements for, how often are they going to be updated? And then we want to make sure the policies not only address substance use, but that they also require and build in sustainability for our prevention programs and practices. So here's a cartoon, teacher sitting at her desk thinking to herself with a kind of sad look on her face, so they're supplying Narcan to the schools now. No problem, no argument, all well and good and sadly necessary. But I can't help thinking, if only it were that easy for the schools to get proper staffing and supplies, maybe we'd be able to educate students enough so they wouldn't turn to opioids in the first place. So for schools, their priority is academic proficiency. That's what they're thinking about. They're tested based on reading, writing, arithmetic. That's their R's. Resilience, You got to have resilience in order to be able to be academically proficient. So how can we help? Coalitions, communities, and schools need to work together in a strong collaboration based on the culture and needs of the schools. The first thing I always talk about is how we can be helpful. I mean, that's our job. We're coming to them. Sometimes they come to us because of that 3 to 5% of students, but by and large, we're coming to them. So we want to be as generous as possible, make it as easy as possible for students to build, for schools to build resilience in youth and families. So we want to offer programs and training for staff. We can be the trainers. We can bring in the programs, right? We can bring in those curriculum, we hope. We want to offer communication support, use all of our incredible communication expertise to make them look as good as possible and make it as easy as possible for them to communicate with youth and families. We want to offer and support opportunities for parent engagement, really strengthening that protective factor, holding parent meetings, helping them connect, making their parent-teacher conference and their parent events that much more accessible, making them linguistically, you know, we can't forget those linguistically and culturally sensitive ways that will enhance those relationships. Of course, we want to offer evaluation prevention expertise and share results, and then, if at all possible, help them find funding and resources, because our grant writing skills, if we bring that to them, they say yes. A colleague of mine just got a great grant bringing life skills training to the schools. It would never have happened. With that grant, she can provide teacher training, and it will really make a difference in those middle schools. A few other things to know about school culture. I know I've highlighted language, right? And need that their priorities are often different than ours, and we need to meet them and help them with building resilience. But relationships are absolutely critical, that those relationships with every school staff member, from the principal to the secretary, to the custodian, to the coach. And you know, we know about building relationships, and we really need to pay attention to that, especially with support staff. The little things matter. Making copies. They often have a limit to how many copies they can make. So, you know, when I talked about helping with those surveys, doing those supportive administrative tasks for them can go a long way. Understanding and speaking their language, talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions, and just in general, if a school district person uses some language you'd understand, ask. We can share data research and other resources, and most importantly, we really want to help link them, provide those linkages to all the community groups that we're connected to. It takes persistence. When staff used to start with me and they'd say, how do I reach this principal? They're not calling me back. You know, start with an email, call 3 times, and then you show up. It's okay to show up at schools. They actually like it. It's a lot of how, you know, again, depends upon the school culture, but certainly in the districts that I've worked with, it's amazing what can happen in those informal interactions. A few controversial issues I'd like to raise before you get to ask the questions. One is, what about stories of people with lived experience? I certainly was contacted and have been contacted by groups like Narcotic Anonymous, people who, you know, been impacted themselves, peer support folks who want to come and speak to students in a universal capacity. My recommendation is not to use that kind of intervention as a tier 1 intervention. In some cases, you may spark interest or attention that might not have otherwise been there. Sometimes it glamorizes substance use, and sometimes it exposes substance naive students to things that they don't need to know about or be exposed to, or even draws them, wow, I could belong to a group like that. I could have that recovery experience. So I recommend saving that kind of direct contact for tier 2 or tier 3 interventions with students who are already involved in substance use, particularly at the tier 3 level. Scare tactics, I think we know, they don't work. Not sure there's much else to say about that. We wish fear-based information would. What we do know is credible drug information is a good thing, especially in terms of motivational enhancements. You want to look at both sides and be seen as a fair source. But just scaring youth is not going to have the impacts we want. Drug testing has been suggested as a panacea, random universal drug testing for any student involved in extracurricular activities. About a third of our schools do that. It's expensive, it takes time, and according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's no evidence to support that it's effective. So again, as a Tier 3 intervention, students already involved, that might be recommended. And finally, what about those free resources you're offered, a speaker, educational materials, from the alcohol industry, tobacco industry, pharmaceutical companies. And studies of the tobacco industry materials have shown that it actually increases behavior. I haven't seen studies of pharmaceutical materials, but I've certainly done deep analysis of the alcohol industry materials, and I strongly recommend that there be a policy that those not be used by schools. We can't know that they're neutral, or in some cases, they may be harmful. Now, Sean, it's yours.
Thank you, Shelley. That's excellent. I wanted to start with some questions from the audience, if that's all right. First, Shelley, could you give a brief introduction to mental health first aid? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure. Mental health first aid is a evidence-based program that trains adults and in some cases youth to do early intervention around mental health concerns. And it's an 8-hour training. There's one for adults, and there's one that's actually youth mental health first aid, specifically for people who work with youth. And highly recommended. Many schools have chosen to have all their staff participate in this 8-hour training, or in some cases, just their secondary school staff. But it really makes people much more comfortable and deep with addressing mental health issues, gives them the skills and tools, and also it helps to destigmatize.
And thank you. The specific question here is on the development and the rollout of that youth mental health first aid piece. Do you know where we are in terms of that being tested, of that rolling out on a larger scale?
I don't know. I know that I'm not familiar with that. Something I certainly could take a look at. We are, working on at the state level here in New Mexico. There are people who do train the trainers. A number of districts have taken that on. I don't know if any states have policies that require that, or any districts have built that into their policy, and it's something that I'd be happy to take a look at.
All right, thank you. The second question that I'd like to address is on specific support programs for vaping and tobacco cessation. How can we help youth quit the nicotine habit?
I think the first thing we need to do is, which we're waking up to, is we need to take this really seriously. Nicotine is, as many of us know, perhaps the most highly addictive drug, quickly moves to dependence, and nicotine in e-cigarettes has been a serious problem since it caught us unawares. This has been going on for 5 years, really started 10 years ago, and of course now it's just exploded. So I think the first thing is that schools, and I've worked extensively on tobacco policy. We need to make sure that e-cigarettes are treated similar to other tobacco products in our school policies. We need to address on a larger societal level that all of our clean indoor air policies include e-cigarettes and vaping devices. And finally, we need to add to our prevention education Tier 1, right, that universal instruction, and include in screening e-cigarette devices and vaping. It is a huge problem for schools. I just confiscated a bag of about 15 devices from a middle school, K-8, that were collected in the last 4 months of last year. It's interrupting and disrupting instruction, and I think there's a need to incorporate that information as well as that intervention and recognize that it's for some students, it's going to require cessation approaches and treatment, because that nicotine addiction, or if they're putting other kinds of substances into e-cigarettes, can be quite serious and a threat to their health, including some of the people we've known who've died.
That's excellent. And from CADCA's side, I would also add, Shelley, you mentioned that we were sort of caught unaware on this front, and I can't agree more. CADCA has put out some pretty helpful reviews of what is the situation, especially with electronic devices for taking in nicotine. And so that series is part of the Practical Theorist series, and that's available on CADCA's website as well. So one of the first things we need to do is get the adults in our community aware of what it is that is going on with youth.
Great. We're playing catch up, you know. I don't mean ketchup and mustard. I mean catch up. Really, we were surprisingly caught unawares, and it's a very serious substance use concern. We're seeing overall trends in reduction of alcohol, trends in reduction of non-medical use of prescription drugs. Marijuana, little different because of, I think, the change in attitudes and beliefs. But we are seeing huge increases, in e-cigarette use, and it's quite concerning.
All right. I believe we have time for one or two more questions. I'd like to ask, you highlighted how youth can sort of serve as leaders in their community, and that's beneficial not only for the people that they are mentoring, but the people who are mentors themselves benefit from it as well. Could you highlight sort of first steps if my school has nothing of that nature? How could I start working this type of student leadership prevention program in my community?
That's a great question. So I think the first steps are to identify adult champions who are willing to identify youth champions. So you can hold some kind of, finding a school counselor, a teacher who has a particular passion around wellness. We've generally framed it around wellness because, that's the positive as opposed to drug-free or substance use prevention. And with those youth who've expressed an interest and an adult leader to organize an activity, educational event, gathering, set up a table at lunch, and identify youth who are interested in participating, maybe to be trained as natural helpers, as peer helpers, to do education, to do media projects. That can be a way to really engaging youth. Do some kind of art poster contest, or now with social media, video contest. And by creating that kind of activity, you will attract a group of youth who then may become interested in doing much more. And I think starting with that small group, things grow and things multiply. And again, through social media and through all the different informal ways that youth communicated with each other to create exciting opportunities for them to do things together to serve. And I think that finding a good name and logo, and then providing leadership training, or as I said, actually peer helping training, provides them with skills and resources so that they can really make an impact.
And thank you, Shelley. And this final question, I believe, is somewhat related. If I'm working in a very complex school district, so many different schools, complex leadership structures, and lots of different stakeholders and personnel, along with diverse policies, how can I work across so many sort of different settings of schools and bring people together to create a comprehensive environmental approach?
So I think in that kind of situation, what you ideally would do is create some kind of advisory council or coalition group, even with the task force within the district. And we had a task force that involved multiple levels of school leaders in multiple roles, and not just leaders, but principals and staff and teachers, students and community members who came together periodically. It can be something built into a policy, or it can be a way of starting a policy so that you have that task force or group that meets, potentially initially it might be quarterly, comes together in a Safe Schools, Healthy Students kind of council. And then, as the facilitator of that, and possibly finding a school leader to co-facilitate with you, you can start to build those relationships and build those strategies that are going to move you in the direction that you want.
Great.
So it's building an inside, or a combination, I think ideally school and community kind of board or council or task force, so that you can't do it yourself. We know in prevention there's nothing that we can do by ourselves, But I think providing that mechanism so that you have a structured conversation is how I've seen policy change happen the strongest way.
That's excellent. I'd love to follow up from there that, again, as part of the Opioid Response Network, if people in their communities want help with strategic planning, with capacity building around that type of task force, that's 100% of the mission of Opioid Response Network. So you have development resources available through technical assistance requests through the opioidresponsnetwork.org website. And we'd love to help you work with some local consultants who have experience doing this type of rollout. With that said, we're coming right up on the hour. I want to thank Shelley for her time today. I'll be following up and sharing the resources that Shelley has shared with us, as well as the PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. And I want to thank all of the attendees today for joining us. Again, my name is Sean, so please don't hesitate to email me if I can be a resource. So,
and please feel free to contact me directly as well. Thank you all for participating.
All right. Have a great day.